Hi, everyone. This is Alex Reeby, immigration attorney with Murray Asario. And today I have a special guest. I have with me Awel Abdu. He is the legal navigation program manager at Asylum Works. And Asylum Works is a local Washington, D.C. nonprofit which provides cultural and linguistically appropriate services to empower asylum seekers and other underserved newcomers. So he's here with me today, and he's going to be asking me some questions about what makes an asylum case strong, about the asylum process, and tips for asylum. So I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you, Alexandra. This is actually very important topic to talk about, and I appreciate Morezorio and we are so happy for working with you because you are assisting our clients in filing a mandamus as well as in coordinating the Know Your Rights trainings. So this is the questions that we usually receive from our clients, and they usually say what makes an asylum case strong. So let's start our discussion with the definition of refugee and also experiencing persecution. So
Yeah.
it's because one has to make sure before applying for asylum that if they fit to the definition of refugee and also experiencing persecution at least on one or more than one basis of those five grounds. So can you explain more about the definition of refugee and those five grounds?
Yeah. So it so in order to apply for asylum, one, you have to be in the United States. Okay. So the definition of an asylee and a refugee are actually identical. It's just a refugees outside of the United States and asylees in the United States. And so, in order to win the asylum case, as you just mentioned, there's a lot of different prongs. Okay. So, a good way to try and separate it is that you have to prove, and as the applicant, you have the burden of proof. So, you have to prove that you have either suffered past persecution or you have a well founded fear of future persecution on account of, because of, motivated by at least one of five protected grounds. And it could be multiple, but at least one. And those five protected grounds are your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, or if you're a member in a particular social group. And that persecution has to be either committed by the government or a group that the government is unable or unwilling to control. So that's the definition. Obviously, all of those prongs then are very legally complicated as well. Like, what is persecution? What does it mean to be on account of something? What does it mean to be part of a particular social group? Those are all also legal definitions, but that's the general definition.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really interesting. It reminds me of another questions about actual persecution versus fear of persecution, well-founded fear.
Yeah.
So, if a person has experienced actual persecution, does this make his case stronger than if he
Yeah.
only have well-founded fear?
Yeah. So this is a really good question. So as I mentioned earlier, it can be either. Okay. So sometimes you have a situation where you might be from a country. Okay, you might have a situation where you've been in the United States for many years. Maybe you're here on a student visa, and then a war breaks out in your home country, and you've been here for 5 years on a student visa, and you've been fine, but a war breaks out in your home country, and maybe um, there's a particular targeting of your race or of your political group that you identify with. And so perhaps nothing has happened to you yet, but that's because you've been abroad and now you're afraid because of this new change in circumstances, right? And so your claim would be based on a well founded fear of future persecution. And so the question you asked is a really good one is, does it make your case stronger though if you already have the past persecution? In some ways, yes. Okay. That's not to say that you cannot win or shouldn't file a case solely based on well founded fear. our office has won many cases solely based on well-founded fear. However, it is easier when you already have the past persecution. And the reason for that is because the legal standard's a little bit easier because you get what's called a rebuttable presumption. So what that means is if I've been imprisoned, beaten, raped, then I get the presumption, I get the benefit of the government presuming that if this already happened to me, if I return home, it will continue to happen to me. And so I then have that, I get the benefit of that presumption, and it would be the government who would have to show that no, the persecutor is now dead, or there's been a fundamental change in like the country structure or something like that, where you're no longer at risk. So you can file a claim only on well-founded fear. However, you don't get that presumption. And then the other reason is just because if you've been in the country and you haven't experienced harm, then obviously an adjudicator, an asylum officer, an immigration judge might say, well, wait a second, why didn't you experience harm if you were already living there based on those protected grounds? But again, things might happen. You might have a new sexual orientation. You might change your political opinion. You might, your family might be experiencing new harm that didn't happen before. So there are ways around it. It just does make the case probably easier to build on, I would say, if you've already had the past persecution happen to you.
Thank you. That's a good explanation. So there are also some statutory bars or limitation to the application of asylum. So what are these limitations and how they affect asylum application?
Yeah, so there are some bars. And so there's a list of them. The ones that come up most commonly would be the 1-year bar is something that comes up very commonly. So the 1-year bar essentially says that you have to file for asylum within your first year of your last entry to the United States. So not your first entry. Some people have been in and out on tourist visas, but your last entry into the United States. Now, there are exceptions, right? There's 2 big categories of exceptions: exceptional circumstances and change circumstances. Change circumstances, as I mentioned, might be like an actual change in your home country. So maybe I'm here and I've been living here in the United States for a long time. But now there's this new war that's happening in my home country that makes me afraid. And I wasn't afraid 3 years ago when I got here, right? So that would be a change in circumstances that could excuse the 1-year bar. There's also exceptional circumstances. So one category of exceptional circumstances is like severe illness. A lot of people are extremely traumatized from what's happened in their home country. So if you have like a showing of PTSD, that might be a good argument. The other thing is the one that comes up a lot is if you're in legal status. So sometimes people are here on a student visa. And so you don't necessarily have to apply for asylum within the first year of coming to the United States. If you're here in lawful status, you have to apply within a reasonable time, which is construed as 6 months from when you're no longer in legal status. So you come on a student visa, you stop going to school, you're no longer in a student visa status, and then you'd have to apply within 6 months of that date. Or you might have TPS or some other status. Now, there's other bars, and some other bars that come up sometimes is if you've been deported before, and then you might not be eligible for asylum. If you've given material support to a terrorist organization. So there are some countries that have a lot of terrorist organizations, right? And if a terrorist comes up to you and puts a gun to your head and says, give me $50, and you give it to them, that could be construed as material support to a terrorist organization. So there are other bars. What is important to keep in mind is if you're worried about a bar, still talk to an experienced immigration attorney, because within that same I-589 form, the one you're filing, there's kind of 2 other applications that you might be eligible for, which is withholding of removal and protection under the Convention Against Torture, which don't have the same stringent kind of rules for who's eligible to apply. So if you fear returning, talk to an experienced immigration attorney, because you might still be eligible for one of the other two.
Yeah, it's always very important to talk to experienced lawyer
Mhm.
if anyone is not sure if
Yeah.
that limitation and bars apply to them. So now let's say one is fits to the definition of refugee and also has experience of persecution or well-founded fear. Now the next step is supporting those claims by evidences or supporting evidences. So what evidence is required with an asylum application, or do you have any tips for preparing persuasive documents?
Yeah. So great question. I get a lot of people where I'm asking them, they're here in my office and I'm asking them during the consultation, are you afraid to go back? Have you ever experienced harm? And they say to me like, oh, I don't have proof of it. And my answer is always like, I didn't ask you if you have proof. I asked you what happened to you, right? Because I think a lot of people have the misguided conception that like if they were imprisoned, but they don't have a document from the government showing they were imprisoned, then they can't apply. Okay. And that's not true, because your credible testimony, your own words that come out of your mouth, is evidence. Okay. Letters of support from people is evidence. Now, you have to corroborate your claim where you can. So, if, for example, you went to the hospital, the officer might say, or the judge might say, where's your hospital record? And you can't just say, I couldn't be bothered to grab it for you. No, obviously not. But you could say maybe, oh, I went to like a local clinic in the village. They don't keep records like this. And no one wrote anything down. They just tried to like stop my bleeding, and I went on my way. And so if you have a plausible explanation for not having those records and you testify credibly, that can be enough. Okay. Now, in terms of, your other question of how do you prepare the asylum application? I think that is, I can't say that there's a right or wrong answer. So some very good attorneys that I know, do things a little bit differently than I do. So I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it, but the way that we do it in our office is the asylum application, the first 5 pages are biographical. So you obviously have to fill those out as best you can. And then I'm sorry, the first 4 pages. And then the 5th page, there's a question, and it gives you like a small box, right? And that asks you if you or your family has ever been harmed. And then the question underneath asks you if you fear future harm. So that page is incredibly, incredibly important. Okay. Now, what I typically do is I don't use more than that box allows me. I fill out a paragraph explaining the general harm. Okay. So what I mean by that is, let's say people from the government, police officers, came storming into my house and arrested me. I'm not going to say at 6:13 p.m., 3 police officers, dressed in this type of uniform, came to my house. They beat me 2 times on the head, 4 times on the back with a baton. I'm not going to go into that level of detail. And the reason for that is because I think it gives you too much room to then, when you have your interview or your hearing, which often is years later, to then say, wait a second, actually, I think maybe it was 5 officers, not 3, whatever it is, right? And so what I like to do is we need to have the basics there. That is important, okay? But we don't need every single detail, and I like to keep it to a paragraph or 2. And so I generally say, officers came to my house, they arrested me. I was held for a few weeks during that time. This is what happened to me. This is how I was treated. Now, it is important, though, that every big thing is in there. Let's say, for example, I'm a woman and I was raped. Okay. If I don't put anywhere in the asylum application that I was raped, that might be a credibility problem, right? But I don't need to explain the exact circumstances of my rape, in my view, at the time that you're filing the asylum application. And part of the reason that I do it this way is because, again, your interview or your court hearing might be years delayed after you file your application. And so typically during that time, during the time that we have to prepare the application, I will work on a very detailed statement with the client. That's often difficult to get because you have to go through all the trauma of what happened to the person, and that's where you get the details. And that is submitted, when you're in court, you typically have to submit everything 15 days before your full trial, your individual hearing. If you're at the asylum office, it's 10 to 7 days prior to your interview. So that detailed declaration is submitted a couple weeks before the person's going to testify. And so they've read it just right then and there. So if anything, it's not like there's going to be years of time where they can actually, say, oh, actually, my story is a little bit different now. So that's why I do it the way that I do it, and in the sense that I kind of keep it pretty brief, and I don't submit an affidavit when I'm preparing the asylum application, either in court or with the asylum office. I just do the application with like a paragraph or two. The reason I also don't, submit like letters of support, like, oh, well, if you were my husband and maybe you have something to say corroborating my story, I don't necessarily get letters of support at the time that I submit the asylum application either, only because you might have to rewrite that story, right? Or that letter, rather. Because if you're in my home country and I've been living here for the last 5 years, and for the last 5 years, people have been coming to the house looking for me, well, that's going to be, you're going to need to write a second letter explaining what's happened in the last 5 years. Rather just get one letter from you. That's my preference. You know, that's my preference. But at the same time, I will say that the asylum office is tricky. Court is a little bit easier because you do know when you're going to have a court hearing. The asylum office is tricky. So today, just today, I got a notice for an interview. That interview is coming up in 2 weeks. I filed that application personally in 2015. Okay. Filed it 9 years ago. And now I have like a week to finalize everything because I have to file all supporting evidence 7 to 10 days beforehand. And I grabbed the file and I looked at it, and we've already done the affidavit. We've already started. I gave the client a checklist of documents. We've already started doing a lot of things, right? Which I'm so relieved because now I don't have to wait until the last minute. So I wouldn't necessarily want to wait till last minute either. But I don't think you need to file everything right up front for the reasons I said.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation, because I observe like to approach on that. Some
Yeah.
lawyers, just to file I-589 without supporting evidences, and some
Mhm.
prefers to file everything at once. So it's just good to know the advantage and the disadvantage of the two approach.
Exactly.
So yeah, the other one is about the personal statement. Actually, you've touched
Mhm.
about that, but what is your advice on how to write strong personal statements, and what should be included in that?
Yeah. So I think, again, in my view, having details in the personal statement is important. However, as a lawyer, I also look at the trauma level of the client, okay? Because sometimes you can tell that the client is really almost like disassociating and they're not, I don't want to rely on what they're saying, not because they're lying, but because they might have like false memories. They might not be able to remember everything accurately. A lot of people that are very traumatized have issues with chronological order, like they remember things in different orders than actually what happened. And so you have to be careful adding too much detail and like cornering the person into an answer when the person might just be so traumatized that they might not be able to tell you. Like if I say, okay, how many people beat your child on that occasion, and it's about your child, and you're like, oh, I don't know, like, and you're just confused because it was so traumatic. then maybe you just write in your affidavit, men beat my child or police officers beat my child or whatever, so that it's not cornering you into there were three people when the person isn't themselves, like they just can't fully, remember the event. Um, I think that sometimes clients like to start their own statement, because it just gives them more time to kind of sit and think about it and take their time with it. However, I always have a follow up conversation with the client. My preference is in person, although I will do it on phone or Zoom if the client requires or needs that. The reason I prefer in person is because I know their surroundings. If it's on phone, I don't always know. Maybe, their kids are in the room and they don't want to say certain things, right? And so that's why, like, for my affidavit appointments, I prefer at least Zoom where I can see you. And I think also seeing people, there's a better kind of connection made so that the story can be shared better. But I think that, whenever you're writing an asylum statement, the reason that we don't just, my office would never just submit the statement of my client, right? And the reason for that is because, and I've seen attorneys do this, where I'm like, really? There's like, this is what the statement is? Oh, well, that's what I wrote. And it's not because the client isn't sophisticated or well educated or doesn't know what happened to them. It's because the client doesn't know the definition of asylum, most likely because they're not an immigration attorney, right? And whenever you're writing one of these statements, you have to think about the definition of asylum and what exactly you're trying to prove. Because when a persecutor harms you, they might say a million different things, which not all of them are relevant, right? Like they might call you, all kinds of names and whatever. Maybe they're not all relevant, but maybe they mentioned your father who was a political activist, right? That might be relevant, right? Because then you have a PSG based on family. And so the person might not know, okay, well, the fact that they mentioned my father, why does that matter? They were calling me all these names and beating me and whatever. And they might not know that that's actually a really critical fact to determine motive. And so that's why you really have to understand kind of where you're going with the case and what your legal theory is as you're drafting the affidavit.
Yeah, thank you so much. As a part of like supplementary document is witness statement or affidavit, and as well as expert witness statement is also very important. So what are these statements and how can one get them? What are the, especially this is actually happening, especially if a person who is writing an affidavit lives back home and the person who is applying is having a time, difficult time getting all that documented. So what are your advice on that?
Yeah, so kind of two parts to that question. So one question, it seems like it was about letters of support, like from your family and friends that are like eyewitnesses to things, right? And so I think a lot of times people focus on the wrong, like they'll say, "Oh, Owl is such a nice man. He always, whenever I didn't have enough money, he brought me dinner, whatever." Like because people sometimes think, "Oh, that's what we need to show for asylum," but whether you're a nice man or you're not a nice man really has nothing to do with asylum, right? It's what harm happened to you. And so I think sometimes they focus on like the qualities of the person. Um, so I think for those letters of support, the person needs to explain what they know, like what they witnessed. I witnessed I will get picked up by four police officers. I witnessed a criminal group beat him up or whatever, right? What they witnessed, what they know firsthand, what they've maybe heard, like, firsthand from other people. That's what they need to write in the statement. And I don't, again, if there's some discrepancy about, like, I'm not saying there has to be so much detail to where you say this occurred on May 21st at 6 p.m., but just some level of detail, because I think that the other thing that I often see is letters of support that just say he was harmed by the government. It's such a pity. Please, take please keep that in mind. So you need more than that. And then for the expert reports, there's kinds of two real classes of experts that I often use. A psychological expert, which is somebody either like a licensed clinical social worker or a psychologist, psychotherapist, or country conditions experts. Those are people that maybe are authors, PhDs, government officials, people that have worked and studied in that home country that can testify to the country or can testify to the person's trauma. And then sometimes there's medical experts, like, for example, if the person has undergone FGM or something else and they need a medical evaluation. So if it's these people can be expensive. They charge money typically, unless you can find a free one. And so you don't always need either, and you don't always need both. But I think that's the conversation to have with your attorney to see, what is necessary here. Because I can say that for some countries, I can print out 300 pages of documents showing what exactly is happening to a group of people. And I don't need an expert to clarify that, right? However, if it's not very well documented, or maybe there's been kind of a change in policy regime outwardly, but there's still like problems inside the country that it's not as widely available on the news, maybe you get a country expert. If you're worried that your client is not going to be able to testify well because they're so traumatized, then I would do a psychological expert, because I can say, look, this person has severe PTSD or suicidal ideations. And a lot of times the officer or the judge will kind of rely on their report as opposed to needing all that testimony.
Thank you. So, does the person's status, immigration status, matters, especially if a person who is writing a supporting evidence is living here and that he has also a pending asylum application?
No, not at all. So no, in fact, it really doesn't. Those people can, if they're really critical witnesses, they can actually even come and testify. They usually have to sign like a release, and give their A number. But especially if they have an asylum case pending. But no, even if they're totally undocumented, even if they have a removal order, you don't have to necessarily write your address. Typically what I'll do is I'll submit the letter either notarized or with a copy of an ID document. And that's always been accepted by the asylum office and the court.
Yeah, because I have like experience when one of my clients was asking me about that. That's why I'm asking you. Thank you for clarification. I think that's all I have. But if you have anything like, especially any tips or any advices, or you want to give to our audiences with regard to what asylum officers is concentrated on in evaluating the asylum application.
Yeah, I would just say that, obviously review your affidavit before going in, review your application. If there are errors on the application, it's no problem. If there are like small errors or small updates, the officer will make them. You just have to be, speak slowly, make sure you bring an interpreter with you if you don't speak English. And just state your story. Just make sure that you're clear about what your story is, and then you should be fine.
Thank you so much. Thank you this for wonderful presentation. I think a lot of people, our clients and any other people who are in asylum process would benefit from this presentation. Thank you so much. So
thank you.
We'll also have a similar presentation next time on different topic. Thank you.
Absolutely. Love to. All right. Thank you so much for your questions. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye.